And we are back. It's Tuesday, July 24th. This is the Infowars Nightly News. I'm your host, Rob Dew. And we're joined now by Webster Tarpley. He's featured in many films we've done, most notably Obama Deception and Fall of the Republic, where we detail a lot of Barack Obama's plans to go in and start wars in Africa, do more destabilization in the Middle East, and just basically continue the agenda of the globalists. And now for an update on Syria, what's going on there, especially with these new reports of chemical weapons coming out, we turn to Webster Griffin Tarpley. How you doing, sir?
Hi, Rob. Thank you very much.
So give us that new big update on Syria.
Well, I think it's important to point out that we've had some very, very dramatic events, maybe a turning point in the Syrian conflict in the last week. And I think it's been widely misreported or ignored here in the West. If we can just go back a little bit. On July 8th, Hillary Clinton issued a warning to Syria saying, you have very little time left to avoid a catastrophic assault on Syria that will lead to the smashing of the Syrian state, And in response to that, before too long, Russia had announced that they were sending 11 warships to the eastern Mediterranean as a kind of a counterbalance against that. But what Hillary Clinton had in mind, we finally saw last week. It's an attempt by NATO to orchestrate a perfect storm of converging attacks on Syria with the hope that they could bring about the collapse, the catastrophic collapse of the Assad government in the form of a coup d'etat, without the need to have a full-scale NATO bombing campaign, NATO invasion. And the main headline is, so far, this has not worked. It has failed. And I'm maybe just tick these off. I can identify maybe 7 prongs in the attack. First of all, what we found out in the Washington Post in the last couple of days is that the U.S. has been running a campaign, first of all, to get Iraq to prevent direct flights between Iran and Syria, because the U.S. says that's delivering various kinds of war material, sophisticated weapons, and so forth. So they turn the screws on Iraq and get some of these flights canceled. They also turn the screws on Egypt to prevent Iranian ships from going through the Suez Canal, which they have every right to do by a very important international treaty, so that they could deliver things to Syria that way. So that's number one. The second thing that was designed to converge last week was television fakery. This has been known since about the 11th of June. Thierry Meyssan, reporting from Damascus, reported that there was a plan by the U.S., NATO, the CIA, and the rest of them, the Israelis, to take over Arabsat and Nilesat to prevent the Syrian state television and Adunia and Sham television, in other words, the pro-Syrian, sometimes pro-Assad television channels, to kick them off the air and then to replace them with fake broadcasts that were going to be generated by NATO, by the CIA. It also involved sound stages and outdoor sets of the kind we saw last year in Libya. Remember the green square, the fake green square that had been created in Doha, in Qatar? This time it's going to be, and they have them, downtown Damascus, downtown Aleppo, downtown Homs, and the presidential palace of Assad. So the plan was to take over these satellites and to replace them with fake channels, and then also to have CNN and the BBC and France 24 and the rest of them ready to go with programming that would back up on this brainwashing stuff. The point, though, is that since this was reported so widely before the fact by Meyssan, I think I contributed something to it. By the time we got to this week, the Syrian information minister came out and said they thought they would surprise us by cutting off our television, which was done now in the last week. But it hasn't worked because they were ready for it, right? They blunted the psychological effect, and they had workarounds. They said, if you can't get us on Arabsat and Nilesat, try another satellite called Atlantic Bird, or you can try other possibilities. In other words, the Syrian channels were putting on public service announcements saying our station can go off the air at any time, and you will essentially see zombie personnel telling you bad things about Assad and Syria. Don't believe it. This is something we know about. So that didn't pan out. Now, the third one was the attempted decapitation of the Syrian armed forces, and that was last Wednesday. This explosion in one of the main government office buildings in Syria that killed the defense minister, the deputy defense minister, the crisis management director, and then mortally wounded also the intelligence chief. 4 important people were knocked out. Others were wounded. I don't believe that was a suicide bomb. I think that was a drone. That was a missile shot from a drone targeting a specific window and office complex to try to decapitate the Syrian forces. It is interesting that the main victim, the defense minister, Raja, is the top Christian in the Assad government. So there's an extra added venom coming from the al-Qaeda fighters against anybody who's a Christian. And in Syria, you can be a Greek Orthodox, you can be a Maronite, you can be a Greek Catholic, a so-called Melkite. So,
well, let me stop you real quick, Webster. What's your evidence that this was a drone?
No evidence to speak of. It just that this story that it was an infiltrated suicide bomber, I think, stinks, because that's sort of, Operation Splinter Factor, right? That's designed to make people paranoid, right? Is the guy next to me loyal or is he disloyal? But I think it's much more likely to have been a drone. Anyway, there's no proof that this entire assassination story is shrouded in mystery. And I would say, don't forget about the possibility of a cruise missile, of a drone, because the drones are flying all over the place. And why wouldn't they try to do this? Now, the point is that was supposed to lead to the defection of army units. They said the 4th Armored Division is going to go to pieces. The Republican Guard is going to collapse. None of that happened. And instead, Assad kept control of the situation. He nominated replacements for these guys, and he's continued to sort of reshuffle the top leaders, right? And that's been going on up until today, still going on. So the integrity of the Syrian state apparatus has been maintained. So that was the third point. Fourth point is the U.S. and the British had prepared currency warfare. They were trying to organize a panic run on the Syrian currency to try to collapse it and increase the sense that it's the apocalyptic end of the world, right? So this stuff is going on. That also didn't work. The currency more or less resisted. And then maybe the most dramatic, swarming. It's been now reported that the Syrians have found fighters from Libya, from Egypt, from Jordan, just in the last couple of days. The swarming was another NATO airlift. This is the second time they've done it. It was first done a couple of months ago. But they brought in thousands upon thousands of fanatics, right? Al-Qaeda types, jihadis, mujahideen, unemployed people, mercenaries from all over the Middle East and well beyond, to try to funnel them across the border into Syria just to create chaos and confusion. Now, these people are not really militarily trained. They're not organized into proper military units. Their armament is also maybe a little bit hit or miss. But the idea was that they could go in, take over large parts of Damascus, Aleppo, and these other places, and then hold them for long enough to make the Syrian leadership think that the world was coming to an end and they had to run for the hills, right? It's a psychological warfare strategy, as I think we've pointed out. By the way, the kingpin of the psychology warfare side is Ben Rhodes, sitting in the Obama White House. This is the guy who orchestrated Obama's primary campaign. He's the boss of Favreau the last time around, the speechwriter. And the specialty of Ben Rhodes, and it was noted at the time, the Obama campaign wanted to make its opponents in the Democratic primaries think that their world was collapsing, that it was futile to resist Obama, that he was unstoppable, that the battle was over. You might as well go home. That's what they tried to convince the Syrian people of, right? That they were already defeated and they might as well just accept that fact. And it didn't work. So that's the swarming. Now, here's the thing with the swarming. Those foreign fighters, those low-level jihadis, went into Damascus and into Aleppo. In Damascus, they have been smashed. They've been wiped out. A lot of them have simply been exterminated, killed, wounded, missing. Hundreds killed, hundreds captured. So a significant part of the available manpower is now no longer there. In other words, there's a limited supply of these people, right? There's not an infinite number of people who are willing to undertake such a thing. And that is what's happening in Aleppo right now. But even the Washington Post today reports the rebels have lost the gains they made before the bombing in Damascus. They are now being mopped up. So for the Syrian military, it's Operation Mop Up. Now, the other thing is that that whole operation, and this is my 7th point, extended into Iraq. Iraq seen as a possible supporter for Assad, under Iranian influence, generally speaking, sympathetic to Assad. So there was what you see today in the last 24 hours, a huge wave of bombings, 100 or more people killed, biggest upsurge since the U.S. forces left. A lot of them did anyway at the end of December. So all of that was supposed to cut off the possibility of getting help from Iraq, and that part has gone on. So you get the idea. All of these 7 things, right? The cutting of the supply lines, the action in the United Nations that was vetoed by Russia and China, right? If that had gone the other way, it would have led to panic within Syria. The TV fakery, the drone, or I think drone assassinations to decapitate the government, the attempt to collapse the currency, the swarming of these foreign fighters was an absolutely key part of it. The fact that that extended to Iraq. Now, the result is that, again, a lot of those swarming fighters have been wiped out by the Syrian army, which is now methodically mopping up. So where does NATO go from here? They've given it their best shot. That was the perfect storm, and it didn't work. And the continuity of the Syrian government seems to be assured. At that point, they come up and they start whining about chemical weapons. This is obviously an attempt to build a pretext to have an invasion, because the point is you can't overthrow Syria in the way you could Libya. In Syria, the rebels, despite all the aid they've been given, they're absolutely unable to take and hold any city, any town, any part of the country. There just is no place where the rebels can say, this is our fortress and nobody else is coming in here. In Libya, of course, that was very different. The whole south of the country became a springboard for the attack on Gaddafi in Tripoli and the western part. So this adds up to a bad situation for NATO. Either they drop the whole thing or they escalate, and with the escalation, they run into Putin, because Putin is obviously the other side. Putin will retaliate. How will he retaliate? That nobody knows, but people in Washington, London are afraid to find out, because there are things that Putin can do that would make their lives, I think, very, very difficult. The other side of this is the retaliation, I take it, can be seen in some place like Saudi Arabia. A couple of days after the 4 top people in Damascus were killed by this bomb or rocket or cruise missile, we have a bomb going off at the comparable building in Saudi Arabia. In other words, the Saudi Arabian intelligence and military security headquarters gets bombed, and among the victims is the deputy to Prince Bandar, right? Prince Bandar, sort of below the radar these days, but obviously Prince Bandar being a very important figure in the destabilization of Syria. It is known that Bandar's representatives have taken part in the planning sessions for this television warfare, this video fakery attack, along with the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, along with British and Israeli and other representatives. They've all been in the meetings, but Bandar is sort of the host for these things, and Bandar is the host for building these sets, right, sound stages inside Saudi Arabia, because apparently they're so big that Qatar is too small to hold them, or you can't build them and keep them a secret. So it looks like that was an attempt to kill Prince Bandar, and again, his deputy did succumb. So that's sort of the idea. One of the ways this could end, I think, is that if the U.S. and NATO keep pushing on Syria, this is destabilizing the whole region, and Saudi Arabia is far from being immune. If you get all this, stuff about, democracy and the revolution and so forth, that could turn out very badly for this reactionary feudal royal family of Saudi Arabia, Bandar and all the rest of them, right? The Sudairi clan, the Sudairi wing of the Saudi royal family, because there are things going on in Saudi Arabia of which we know very little. There are demonstrations, there are riots, there are protests that get almost no coverage, no reporting internationally, but they're going on and they're building up. And I would say watch Saudi Arabia in the next week or so. Will that hit on Bandar in his office, will that lead, is that the go for something big inside Saudi Arabia, which is just a guess coming from me at the present time, but at least the attempt to retaliate against Bandar, I think, is pretty clear that did occur.
Wow, that is a very high level analysis there that we've been receiving, because we're not getting that information here in the United States. We're getting Syria's got chemical weapons. They're going to use them if attacked. And it's the whole thing, it's kind of the rehash of the Iraqi situation.
Right.
And that's usually what we see from, U.S. media.
There are a couple of other things that might be of interest. The entire propaganda story of what's going on in Syria is now beginning to fall apart in certain parts of NATO Europe in particular. And that means, first of all, Germany. It's very interesting. In the last couple of days, we have some reports that the German intelligence, the Bundesnachrichtendienst of Pullach in Bavaria, they are now saying that the Syrian rebels are heavily Al-Qaeda. This was already known, but this finds in Germany an echo in some of the big press. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung is the biggest conservative paper in Germany. And already about a month ago, they put out a story saying the Hula massacre of late May, early June. The Hula massacre was not done by the Assad government. The Hula massacre was done by the rebels as a publicity stunt to have it blamed on Assad. So the Frankfurter Allgemeine, that's, I don't know, it's the New York Times or the London Times, or it's an equivalent of this. Now they have now been joined by the Springer press, and this means Die Welt of Hamburg, which is the number 2 conservative newspaper in Germany, and most interesting, Bild-Zeitung. And Bild-Zeitung is this tabloid that has 4 or 5 million readers. It may be certainly one of the biggest newspapers in Europe. And their line is now that the Syrian rebels kill people left and right to try to get a NATO intervention. So we're getting the point where the central country of Europe, right, the biggest country in Western Europe, the entire NATO story has now collapsed, not from the left, but from these right-wing characters. So the view from Berlin is that they're afraid, they don't like the idea of Al-Qaeda taking over Syria, and they might be concerned about that. So there are other problems that are emerging for NATO. There's what could happen in Saudi Arabia, what could happen in Germany. If it happens in Germany, you might look for it to kick over into France or Italy or places like this. So I think all of that indicates that it's not a clear victory for NATO at all, and quite the contrary. Their perfect storm last week didn't gel. It just hasn't come together for them, and they're either going to have to escalate or find something else to do. But this is now obviously very dangerous. And in that regard, about 2 weeks ago, we had an article here in the Washington Post by David Ignatius. David Ignatius is a guy with connections to the State Department. And Ignatius was saying, the Saudis have canceled all leaves for their military personnel for the summer. He's saying that the CIA has people on the ground in Turkey, this we know, he seemed to be saying that the CIA has people on the ground in Syria providing command, control, and communications, that the Israelis have gotten into the act by activating their agents along the Syrian-Israeli border, since Syria is a frontline state. But the other thing that the theme in this article is, are we in July 1914? July 1914 is kind of a theme in European literature. It's the last twilight of an illusion that there would be peace, and the world was drifting towards war. In those days, it took place sort of out of the public eye in secret messages among foreign ministries. But is July 2012 about to turn into that other July, just about 100 years ago, July 1914? Are we on the verge of some kind of major conflagration? And the answer to that is we could be, if these NATO people are crazy enough to try to say we don't care about the Security Council, to hell with Russia, to hell with China, to hell with everybody else. We're going to have the coalition of the willing, and we're going to start bombing. Now, they were ready to start bombing last week. If Russia and China had not vetoed that resolution, the bombing would have begun within hours, and at that point, that would have been a way to save this this perfect storm. But we may be on the brink of that. We may be in July 1914. Wow.
Well, and we know what happens in World War I. Lots of people die, and the power shifts change a little bit. One thing is for certain, we did cover that Hulan massacre when it happened, and we covered the fact that it looked like that it was done by the rebels and not by Assad's troops. We were talking, we were showing video from eyewitnesses who were disputing everything that the American press was saying by far and large. And then we also showed clips of other massacres where people were pouring fake blood on themselves and they were carrying people away, and then fake funerals where guys would wake up in the middle of the funeral. And it's just an ongoing campaign there of disinformation, not a hot, I mean, it's a hot war, but on top of it, there's this cloak of, you know, technology and media and social media emerging to muddy the waters and to not keep us, not tell us what's going on. How does this all meld with Iran in the current situation? What's going on there?
Well, this is the main avenue of attack against Iran is obviously this, right? This is what's happening right now. If you want to have some kind of attack on Iran, then you've got to make sure that before you do that, you wipe out Syria. In other words, the goal of all of this is what Hillary Clinton said, to smash the Syrian state. And when you have these swarming terrorists, right, you're sending in criminal elements, convicts, God knows what, right? The dregs of the North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, out to Pakistan and the gates of China, right? You're sending them in. That's to destroy civilization as we've known it. So that's the goal of the U.S. And the idea would be to break up the Syrian state. You wouldn't have a single government. You'd have Kurdistan seceding. You'd have parts of it going with Turkey. You'd have other parts absorbed by Israel, most likely. The Kurds from as I said before. So it would be tremendous weakening, and then that's a bacillus that might find its way also into Iran. But if you want to go after Iran, you've got to deal with Syria first, because with Syria, you've got a continuous block, more or less, of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, which is sympathetic to Iran and therefore to Syria under Maliki, and then Iran. So you've got to get in there and break that up. Otherwise, you're dealing with something that's much too big. You'll also be cutting off the supply routes to Hezbollah, depriving Hezbollah of their strategic depth. And I would point out that the Palestinians, Hamas, have essentially stabbed Syria in the back by saying they support the attack on Syria, but Hezbollah is hanging tough. They're supporting Assad, and as does Iran, and then the Russians and the Chinese. If you had rational people in Washington, they could say, all right, fine. The U.S. sphere of influence includes Tunisia, Libya now, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all these places. But Syria belongs to the Russian-Chinese sphere, to the Shanghai area of influence, the Shanghai Cooperation Group. But you can see that the U.S., with Hillary Clinton and the rest of these people, they're so crazy that they can't imagine what would be normally be seen as a deal, right? A modus vivendi in diplomatic language, a way of getting along. They can't do that. So they've got to go for the big attack. The other side of it is all this talk about chemical weapons, right? Suppose you're really worried about chemical weapons, here would be a constructive proposal. You could easily say, let Russia be invited by Syria to provide a couple of Spetsnaz brigades and let them assure the security of the chemical weapons stocks so that nobody will come near them and they won't be moved and they won't be used. I'm sure that would be acceptable to, at least to some people in the Syrian government, right? But it would also get Russia recognized as being the patron, the protective power of Syria. So here again, they're not concerned about chemical weapons. You could take care of the chemical weapons question quite easily, but they don't want to do that. They want the issue to beat the Russians over the head, or if necessary, to say, oh, sorry, we have to go outside the Security Council. We're going to have coalition of the willing. We're going to go back to Bush and Cheney, and we're going to have that. So what you get out of this is that the U.S. ruling class, ruling elite, are collectively insane and totally incompetent. They have no idea what they're doing.
Well, that's what we've been saying all along. That sums it up there. They are collectively insane and incompetent, and they should be replaced. But that takes a lot more work than I think the American people are willing to do at this point.
And you got to get some replacements, huh?
Exactly. Some replacements that aren't bought off. One final question. Let's just go over the stuff that happened in Colorado over the weekend with the shooter. We've been saying it's a false flag pretty much from day one. There's all kinds of evidence of other shooters, other people involved. I was reading an interview today where someone said the theater lights and the projector went off just as the attack started. You know, what does that tell you?
Well, I would point to two things. I mean, I think you can basically show that it's a fraud. It's a false flag for sure. First of all, the patsy. There may be no proof that the patsy ever did any of these things, right? Because the patsy supposedly was wearing this gas mask the whole time. So who was it? Was it this guy that we've seen now in the courtroom, or somebody else? So we don't know that. But the most interesting, and people can find this on my Twitter feed, Webster G. Tarpley on Twitter, there are two eyewitnesses from inside the theater who say, right after they came out, there was at least one more perpetrator, a second shooter, if you will, some guy who rolled a tear gas grenade in among the crowd. So, two. As soon as you have two, you're back in the world of Breivik, when there were two, Major Hassan, when there were two or three, Bobby Kennedy, Sirhan. There was obviously another shooter, Hinckley, probably another shooter. In other words, the psychotic patsy cannot be relied on to do these things. You've got to have a technician. You've got to have somebody who's professionally trained to do that stuff.
Someone who's not drugged up on Vicodin.
All this stuff. So that, I think, is number one. The second thing is I don't know if I have the name of the medical school here, but maybe you have it there. A nearby medical school was drilling as an emergency exercise. A shooter goes wild in a theater and starts killing people. Yeah,
that was part of the University of Colorado.
Yeah, it has a somewhat more complicated name, which I just don't have in front of me right now. But once you have those things, you can forget it, right? It's a false flag event. Why? Well, all kinds of reasons, right? To keep false flags alive, right? There's a big vested interest in that. To prepare for possible October surprises or other things, because if NATO doesn't get their way in regard to Syria, the last straw, right? The ultima ratio for NATO is always, if you can't get what you want, try a Gulf of Tonkin, or try a false flag, or try both. So something along those lines, I think, is the reason.
There you go. And we're going to leave it at that. Of course, we could talk for hours. You've got a huge mind, and you've traveled the world. You've even been to Syria and met with the people face to face. So you really know what's going on there. You really have your finger on the pulse.
Let me just say, people should realize Syria is the most tolerant place in the Middle East, by far. And this is one of the reasons they're targeted. The U.S. and the British hate the idea that Syria is a place where all these cliches about, oh, they've hated each other for centuries, it's all baloney. The hotel I stayed in, the receptionist was a Maronite Christian woman. The head of the wait staff was a Sunni Muslim. On his staff, he had Alawites, he had Kurds. And of course, you know, Damascus is where St. Paul converted to Christianity. There's St. Thomas's Gate in honor of St. Thomas, who went off then into the east, got all the way to India, according to some accounts. You can be an Alawite, you can be a Sunni Muslim, a Shiite Muslim. In the Christian, you can be a Maronite, you can be Greek Orthodox, you can be a Melkite, a Kurd, and all of these people were basically doing okay under Assad, and this is precisely what comes under attack. And if you look at the Italian news agencies that deal with the Christian missions of the Vatican, they are warning that if these crazies, if the swarming terrorists take over Syria, there's going to be a massacre of Christians like you wouldn't believe. And I would call on people in the United States, if you call yourself an evangelical Christian, you better dump this policy. You better dump Hillary Clinton and Netanyahu and Obama and Romney, because they all agree. Romney puts himself as the guy who wants more. He wants more attacks and sooner than Obama's willing to do. If you support this policy against Syria, you are part of a strategy of genocide against the Christian minority in Syria, against the Alawites, and so forth. Right? The slogan that's coming from these crazy mouthpieces, and that includes cable television from Saudi Arabia. Right? The Wahhabite cable TV world is also part of this attack. They say, drive out the Christians, send the Christians to Beirut and get them out, right? Ship them out of the Middle East, and kill all the Alawites. So a massacre between Christians and Alawites. It's probably 35% of the whole population. Think of it, 35% of 20 million. You're getting into pretty heavy-duty genocide. So if you're an evangelical Christian, you cannot be a part of this.
I totally agree. And that's the same thing that happened in Libya. As soon as they kicked out Gaddafi and the rest, they started murdering all the black Africans.
And in Iraq, it's the same thing. It happens the same place, all over the place. And if it happens in Syria, then Lebanon, right? Lebanon has a pretty big Christian community, right? And General Aoun, Michel Aoun, is traditionally the leader of that group. What you have in Lebanon is a Christian Shiite alliance. In other words, General Aoun is allied with Hezbollah against the puppet regime of Rafiq Hariri, or the current Hariri. So take a look at that. Again, if you think you're a Christian evangelical, examine the reasons why a very devout Christian like General Aoun makes a deal with Nasrallah of Hezbollah, and you'll see that the whole Middle East is absolutely not what anybody told you, but it's completely different.
Yeah, they do that because they realize they have to live together, and they've decided, well, this is better than killing each other, and that's where we should be going.
And there's a lot more. I mean, there's a positive, there's a mutual interest, which is positive. One of the things they say is we have to defend ourselves against the Israelis.
Right. Well, we're going to leave it at that. Webster, thanks for coming on today and offering us your perspective, and we will talk to you soon.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
You have a good one.